talk about the transformation of anti-Semitism and try to put it in a historical context, knowing that, you know, we're not going to cover everything in detail because that would be a semester's length course. And really, we're just trying to scratch the surface of the topic and hopefully also understand the ways in which it has mutated and how it presents itself and manifests itself today. So that's the purpose. And know that as a historian, it does make me uncomfortable that I have to make some sweeping generalizations, but we can dive deeper into the conversation during Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen and put a PowerPoint up for part of the presentation. Everyone see that okay? Okay, great. And we're going to jump in. So first I will say that we really don't use the term anti-Semitism, or we shouldn't use the term anti-Semitism when it's in its origins, as it is coming to fruition, because that would be anachronistic. The term isn't formed until 1897. So we need to put the idea in the historical context of understanding that when we see the first signs of what we would call Judeophobia, or hatred toward Judaism and toward those adherents of Judaism, it is during the development of Christianity. And we see this coming from the way in which Christianity is presented itself in juxtaposition to Judaism and to Jews. And what I mean by this is that Christianity, as it is forming, is really seen as the new Israel. And as the new Israel, this means that the covenant, the brit that Jews have with God has now been usurped, as it is presented by some Christian theologians. And now there is a new covenant, and that new covenant is specifically with Christians, which for some Christians then developed into a theological framing, suggesting that God ultimately is rejecting the Jews who were his, supposed chosen people. The Torah and all that the Torah is based upon, with all of its rules and legal practices and traditions, is no longer legitimate in the same way. And Jews are perceived as having fallen from God's grace. And because Jews do not accept the divinity of Jesus, which to Jews, obviously, it was tantamount to idolatry, we then begin to see that there is this resentment that is building. Now, without going into great detail around Christian theology, what you then see coming from the church fathers around the 3rd to 5th centuries is a concretizing in many ways of this anti-Jewish sentiment through some of the church fathers' writings, like John Chrysostom, who starts to use very violent language against the Jews. And that kind of violent language has an effect that is both top down and bottom up. And what I mean by that is the top down is that the church, meaning the Catholic Church, and also not only the leaders of the Catholic Church, but the king, the monarchy, who in many ways in this time period is considered to be elected by God and have some sort of divine attributes as well, begin to formulate policies towards the Jews who live within these various empires. That also then bottom up incites mob-like mentality, frustration, and anger. Again, we're talking about in the context of Europe, towards the Jewish people. So this is when we begin to see a few things emerge. For example, and I'll show you an image. This is the image that you see of the idea of the blood libel. This is coming out around between 10th to 12th century, begins in England. And it's this idea that a Christian child would be seduced by the Jewish community for the purpose of taking the blood of that child in order to use for religious practices. And this idea of the blood libel was the idea that Jews, and you can see the way Jews are depicted here, their long noses, they look in some ways as being mean, they are, hurting the child. And all of this is related to that blood libel idea. I'm just going to go back for a second. This idea that Jews contaminate society and that Jews are part of the deicide or the cause of the deicide, that they are the killers of Christ. These ideas only perpetuate the blood libel as a trope that begins to cross boundaries and territories. So you don't only find it in one European society, but you begin to find it across European societies, and it also spreads to the Middle East eventually. When you start to see these blood libels, this is when you begin to have political trials that are mock trials in many ways of what you will see later during the Soviet Union with the Doctor's Plot in the 1950s. But the idea that the rabbis have to stand in defense of their own religious texts, and they are trying to prove certain positions around Jewishness, whereas the religious leaders and the leaders of the society, the kings, are arguing against the Jewish positions. So you begin to see this foment a type of antipathy towards the Jews who are living in these societies. It's also during this period of medieval Europe that you begin to form ghettos, and ghettos were created for the purpose of being able to cordon off the Jews so that they are not always part of society, so that they can be excluded from society. Yes, of course, Jews did want to live together. They felt better having some ability to have some endogamy, marry in, have their own practices inside their own cultural and traditional norms. But it was also because it was imposed upon them. And the first ghettos really do appear in Venice in Italy. And it's for that purpose of trying to make sure that it's very clear to the Jews that they are not always welcome to be part of the larger society in which they are living. Jews living in the region that we would refer to as the Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, do have a different experience than those Jews who are living in a medieval Christian Europe. Of course, we know from the time of Maimonides, there were much better on the ground relationships between Jews and Muslims than there were between Jews and Christians. And it doesn't mean that there weren't also challenges. And the way we see those challenges presented really are in two ways. One was some very specific sort of practices towards Jews. Jews are referred to, just like Christians, as people of the book, Dar al-Kitab. So it meant that there was a special relationship recognizing between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And at the same time, Jews are still, like Christians, infidels in the context of the Muslim world. And because they are infidels, they did have to wear the Star of David, like what we know Jews had to wear during the Holocaust. It obviously predates the Holocaust. And it was a way to clearly identify who Jews were. Synagogues cannot be the same height as mosques. So if you've ever been to Spain, you know that you have to go down to go into most synagogues so that the height of the synagogue doesn't raise above the height of the mosque. Jews could not ride horses and be at the same height as Muslims riding horses. So Jews had to ride donkeys. And this was a way to show very clearly sort of what the pecking order was within the Muslim world. Now, there were those types of, day-to-day realities. And then you have some of the political, theological underpinnings within Islam as well. And those relate to the concept of dhimmi. Jews were considered second-class citizens. They had dhimmi status. Because they had dhimmi status, they had to pay a jizya, a special tax. And it was incumbent as well for those Muslims who felt as if they had to abide by the political, theological underpinnings of Islam, that their job was to spread Islam, Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam. And that was in juxtaposition to Dar al-Harb, the realm of war. And if non-Muslim entities existed within the Muslim realm, Dar al-Islam, then it was incumbent to engage in a struggle, hence jihad. And we see this with radical Islamist movements, such as ISIL, ISIS, where there is a desire to try to bring about the reign of the caliphate again and to spread Islam as far and wide as possible. And we see this specifically with entities like Hezbollah or Hamas, who use that political theological underpinnings. And if you read the Hamas charter, you would find those kinds of citations from the Quran and certain chapters, certain surahs of the Quran, for the purpose of suggesting that Israel has no right to exist within the realm of Dar al-Islam. So this is how we see it playing out within that context. Now, the tropes begin to change a bit between the period of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. It's not just now about Jews and their religious practices. It's not just about seeing Jews in this way in which they are different than the Christian society, but it's also now trying to understand the ways in which Jews wield their influence within the societies in which they are living. So this is a typical stereotype. Jews here, the spider is labeled Rothschild, clearly representing the Rothschild family, and the tentacles, the reach that Jews have across continents to show that transnational identity, the lack of rootedness that Jews supposedly have, and to show, again, this idea that they are able to infiltrate a society, influence a society, and wield outsized proportional influence in a society. And of course, there's also the influence here of money, which is a trope as well. So we begin to see by the period of the 19th century that this hatred of Judeophobia, of Judaism, Jewishness, is now beginning to be more about a hatred towards a particular people. Now, why this is important is because you did have Jews who thought if they converted and left Judaism, then they would not have to necessarily be depicted in this way. And what this form of hatred shows is that it's not about just converting, because if your DNA is a particular DNA, that DNA is immutable. So it doesn't matter if you convert or not, because you are still who you are, and therefore you still pose a threat to the society in which you are living. So this kind of racialized hatred is imposed on the Jews during a period of time in which you see extreme forms of nationalism beginning to emerge. Those nationalist movements that are really trying to create a connection between soil and the land specifically, and blood, the identity of the individual being connected, rooted to that place as the authentic or native population. And the pseudoscience of eugenics, which is not really a science, but it is treated as a science at this point in time, showing how the DNAs combine and how you need to have a pure Aryan identity. The idea of the Aryan here specifically coming from Germany, which is deemed to be the ideal race, the ideal people, and Jews in that equation are not Aryan. They can never be Aryan. And not only can they never be Aryan, ultimately, as Jews, they will always be the other. And if you read texts from the period of the 19th century and then the 20th century, Jews in Europe are often referred to as the Semites, the Easterners, or the Orientals. Now, Semites, as we all know, Semites, we're talking about the region, the Semitic region, known as the Levant, or what we would call the Mediterranean. This is a geographical location. There are some shared characteristics coming from that region, specifically linguistically, right? So whether it's Aramaic, Akkadian, Hebrew, Arabic, they have very similar shorashim at the end of the day, similar roots. That idea of Semitic is transposed then from linguistic and geographic identifiers to identifying Jews as being a Semitic people. Arabs are not talked about as being Semitic in this way at this time. It is a specific demarcation towards Jews. And that matters because by the period of 1897, the German Wilhelm Marr, which is an important date, all of you know, because it's also when you have the first Zionist Congress. This is when Zionism becomes what we know as Zionism today with Theodor Herzl. trying to ask the question of what do Jews do in Europe in order to deal with both the pressure of assimilation and the pressure of anti-Semitism. And it's Wilhelm Marr who coins the term antisemitismus, anti-Semitism, specifically targeting Jews. And this is when you see also that as empires begin to decline, nation states begin to emerge, there are specific policies, whether it's from pogroms, whether it's the utilization of militaries or armies for the purpose of creating hostility, inciting violence towards the Jewish population in that host society. And those practices step up all the more so during the period of the 19-teens and for sure by the period of the 1920s and 1930s as Nazism emerges. And then of course, as we see, the practices of bias and prejudice and discrimination towards the Jews then is escalated to the point of what we know during the periods of 1939 to 1945 are the systematic murder of Jews during the period of the Holocaust. So these are the ways in which we see that first mutation from hatred of Jews because of their religion to now a hatred of Jews because of their supposed racial identity and composition. So for example, here is a map of Central Europe. This map shows in the middle here how the pure DNA would lead to an Aryan versus a mixed individual, which is not preferred. And the pure idea is the preference. And you see why it matters that it is connected to an outline of the territorial space of central Germany to connect it to that idea of territory, land, and soil. And blood is the DNA piece of it. So that's how this plays out. And of course, images that you all know very well during the Holocaust, how Jews were identified. And this is from a period of a youth rally in Austria where you see as young as 5-year-olds, through teenage years, in which all of this is just to note that we didn't start with gas chambers, right? The Germans didn't begin with that. You begin with indoctrination. You begin with, a type of indoctrination that is specific to mobilize around misinformation, disinformation, and repeat a big lie enough, and enough people will begin to believe it. So then how do we see the next mutation? And it's not to say that these other forms of Jew hatred don't continue to exist, meaning there is still hatred towards Jews because of their religion. We know that there is still hatred of Jews because of their perceived racialized identity. But we also know that in the 21st century, we begin to see that it's not just about the religion and the people, but it's also about what it means when Jews identify with the idea of a collective movement for self-determination, which is for the existence of the state of Israel. And of course, I will say, I am not talking about criticism of Israeli policy. I am not talking about criticism of whether you believe Netanyahu should or should not be the next prime minister. I am not talking about whether you think there should be settlements. All of that is always up for grabs. If you know one Israeli, you know that there are 20 positions on each of those issues, just like we as American Jews have perspectives on these issues. What I'm talking about is the idea that Jews as a people have no right to self-determination, that Israel as a Jewish nation state has no right to exist. And that is often the starting point. And for those of you who have heard Natan Sharansky, the Soviet refusenik, he created and coined the idea of the 3 Ds, that when you see a double standard, demonization or delegitimization or dehumanization of Israel, then you need to ask yourself, what is really going on here? Is it criticism or is this actually bleeding into anti-Semitism? And I would subscribe to thinking that those 3 Ds actually provide a decent sort of guidepost to understanding how this plays out. We also see, and especially on college campuses, but not exclusively, that very often American Jews are deemed to be an extension of Israeli policy or Israeli behavior. And then you have a situation in which American Jews are held accountable for specific Israeli actions, which you rarely find any other people in the other community held responsible for another nation state's behavior. So it doesn't mean that groups can't be targeted, because we know, for example, after 9/11, with Islamophobia, many Muslims were targeted, not only Muslims, sometimes Sikhs mistaken as Muslims. But what I'm suggesting is no one walks up to an Arab that I have ever seen from Saudi Arabia and say, you must be responsible for the murder of your, the king who decides to murder the journalist. No one says that, ever. No one says that about what happens in India, Pakistan. No one says it about North Korea and South Korea. It doesn't happen. So the question is, why does it happen towards Jews? And then the other piece of this that's quite challenging around the Israel conversation is that very often, specifically because of the way Israel can be presented, it is often within a left of center political position deemed not to meet the sort of criteria in order to be progressive. So what I mean by that is Israel is often seen as the imperialist, white, colonialist outpost in the region. And therefore, if it is a colonialist, imperialist, white outpost, then you who support it must not be progressive and actually cannot be part of progressive movements. And we can talk about examples in which we have seen Jews being excluded from progressive movements because of their Zionist identification. So again, let me just show you a few images. You see these images in newspapers, you see these on social media. Here, it directly links the Israel situation to the idea of deicide, Jews being responsible for killing Jesus. As you see, the Jew is the Israeli holding his gun and his spear, and who is being killed? But Jesus once again, but Jesus this time is wearing a keffiyeh. So this gives you a sampling of the type of anti-Semitic trope that presents. Similarly here, we have an Israeli soldier, 70 years of existence, strong, big, mighty, Palestinian, small and not so mighty. The Goliath and David have switched positions. What is this ultimately highlighting? And there are plenty of examples like this. Now, we also know that anti-Semitism does not exist just in one political camp. We see expressions of anti-Semitism from the hard right. And when we see it from the hard right, we tend to see it in the American context in the discussion and relationship with white supremacy, Jews, of course, being not white. And in that way, Jews also fit into that conversation the way we saw during the Holocaust. They are the other. And we saw that during the Jim Crow laws, for example. And we also saw it January 6th during the Capitol insurrection. So when you see a shirt that, Capitol insurrection men were wearing, this stands for 6 million wasn't enough. So it gives you a sense of their orientation. We also see this coming out during Holocaust sort of, not just Holocaust deniers, but comparisons to the Holocaust from right of center political camps. So this is an example of trying to connect the idea of the coronavirus specifically to a government regulation of having to have an app or some proof that you have had the vaccine and the government regulations associated with that. And here the idea is that what the government is making us do in terms of the coronavirus and vaccines is similar to what the Jews had to undergo in Nazi Europe, right? And this is coming from the political right. We also saw this meme everywhere online. And this is a meme in which Jews are deemed to be the source of the coronavirus. Jews caused the coronavirus. So this is an example of what the coronavirus looks like under a microscope. And of course, it looks like a stereotypical anti-Semitic trope of a Jew. Looks nefarious, big noses, the tentacles once again. And Jews are damned if they do and damned if they don't, because Jews not only cause the coronavirus, but now it's also Jews who benefit from creating the vaccine. And so now they're just getting wealthy off of the creation of the coronavirus. So again, you see it coming from multiple directions. But don't worry, because we also see it from the hard left. So the hard left is in a different way. in a different way. And sometimes it's actually harder to notice on the hard left because it's not always the typical anti-Semitic tropes, and it's not the terminology of white supremacy, but rather it's, again, this idea that Jews are identified as being colonialists, they're identified as being oppressors, or Israel is, and by extension, if you care about Israel, therefore you must be that as well. But it's also the challenge around some of the causes that most of us care so deeply about, whether it's racial injustice, whether it's about LGBTQ plus issues, whether it's about combating misogyny. But what we're finding is Jews are deemed on the hard left to be white. And if you are white, you therefore have privilege. And if you have privilege, this idea is that you therefore are not able to also be a vulnerable minority. Now, obviously, we know that there is a lot of racial diversity within the Jewish community. It is not homogenous. We do know that there is a lot of Ashkenormativity within the American Jewish community. And so many of us are white passing. I don't deny that. We all know that. But it doesn't mean that if you are white passing, that you don't also still have vulnerability. So the question of how to engage with the hard left for the Jewish community is, how can you begin to have conversations, and how do you have meaningful relationships in which you can say, I want to be able, with the privilege that I do have, in order to provide support, build allies, build bridges, and influence at political levels or policy levels, and recognize that there is a Jewish experience, a Jewish history that is vulnerable and that also cannot be denied. And this form of anti-Semitism that we are seeing on the hard left is now being coined as a term called erasive anti-Semitism. Whether or not that term will stick, hard to know, but that is one of the new terms. So let me just give you some images of how this plays out. We saw this a lot online during George Floyd. And what you see here is an image of an Israeli, not military, but an Israeli policeman. And as an Israeli policeman, he has his leg on the neck of a Palestinian. You see an American policeman with his leg on the neck of an African American, and the two policemen are embraced. The idea here is that the American police learn how to engage in racial profiling from the Israeli police. They bring those practices back to America in order to harm people of color. This has been a major movement called the Deadly Exchange. The Deadly Exchange campaign is taking place on campuses literally across this nation, and encouraging university administrators to not allow university police or local municipalities to not allow their police forces to travel to Israel for professional development purposes to learn about security from the Israeli police. And there is a coupling here that is taking place that suggests that Israel and America, both white, learn how to marginalize and harm communities of color. And unfortunately, this has been picked up by movements such as Black Lives Matter. And then again, this is a typical kind of coronavirus from the hard left. Here is being used to show that it's not just Israel who's causing security and problems with the Palestinians, but it's also the coronavirus being utilized for this purpose to harm the Palestinians. And again, the Jews are the cause of both of these things. And this is coming from a hard left perspective. So this feels pretty depressing. I feel like I'm set up here not to make anyone happy. But what this means ultimately is that the way in which we see anti-Semitism today is that it's very much alive, and you all know that. And unfortunately, it is coming from multiple sides of the political spectrum. It is coming in a variety of forms that are not as always, or are not as easily identifiable for many. It's a more subtle. It comes with coded language, and I can talk more about that later. And Jew hatred does not have the same type of it's not necessarily deemed to be socially unacceptable as other forms of hatred are deemed. And we know examples, and we can talk about those examples. We know that we need to call people into a conversation. We want to assume positive intent when we can. And of course, when we can't, and we know that it's not positive intent, we have to be strong enough to condemn it, no matter where it comes from, whether it's from the hard right, the hard left, radical Islamism, whatever form it takes, because if we don't, that's when we politicize it. And that's a challenge as well. I would argue we need to create brave spaces. People like the term safe spaces. Of course, we all need physical safety, but I think really when we're talking about ideas and our intellect, we need to create brave spaces, specifically because it is getting harder and harder to find individuals who will have upstander qualities and characteristics to call out this form of hatred because it is politically acceptable. And if we don't create those spaces, the herd mentality, which does not require critical thinking skills, sweeps people up into a place in which they are unlikely to be willing to actually condemn anti-Semitism. And then, of course, at the same time, we have a responsibility to build the muscle of compassion, for those who are different than us, from those who do not share the same backgrounds, to learn about different communities, not just our own. And that's, the story of the Jewish people. We are both universalist and particular at the same time, which is actually a pretty incredible thing to be, even when it's challenging. So that's what I would leave with, so that we can open it up to a conversation.
Thank you so much. Maybe I will put us on gallery view so that we can have a discussion now. You gave us so much to think about and digest, thinking historically and thinking about the way anti-Semitism has mutated through the ages and what we face today. So if you have a question, feel free to jump in. Feel free to send me also a chat if you want to ask a question, or if you're not being seen, or if you'd rather just send me any message, feel free. I'll be checking it. But let's just open it up. Feel free to unmute yourself. Speaking of brave space.
I think we're on mute, aren't we? Yeah.
Yes.
Gallery.
You have to unmute yourself.
Yes. Olivia, do you have a question?
Actually, I don't have a question. I just want to share something personal. I come from Romania originally, and funnily enough, one of the first sketches that we saw from medieval England is something so fresh in my mind from when I was a child. I would hear these stories from grandparents or friends of mine, how Christian children would be abducted and the whole thing with the blood would follow and so on. So it's really, and this wasn't medieval England, it was the 20th century, and we should have known better, but it's still there and it exists. So.
Thank you for sharing that. Arnie.
Can Rachel tell us any examples of where, Rachel, you have had a positive interaction with a group, well, such as Black Lives Matter or some group like that?
Yeah, so I'll give you a great example, Arnie. There is an organization called Operation Understanding based in Washington, D.C. There used to be one in Philadelphia. I don't think it exists anymore there, though. And Operation Understanding DC works with bringing together African-American students and Jewish students in the high school ages in order to really work on building bridges between those communities, building that muscle of compassion, and really having one-to-one relationships. I mean, in the style of Rabbi Martin Buber, the I-thou relationship, because when you actually know someone, it makes a difference. Right. They spend time learning about each other's histories. They go to the African American History Museum together. They go to the Holocaust Memorial Museum together. And still, there is a lot of trepidation amongst many of the Jewish students to talk about anti-Semitism, because it just doesn't as easily, it's not as easy to navigate for many of them. But this is an organization that's doing it. And, you know, I've worked with them before and helped them develop some initiatives. And so that's an example. It's small scale. It would take a lot to scale it up to a larger scale, but it's doable. But it really takes the opportunity to have people who are willing to come together in order, in that spirit, you know, to get to know one another.
Cheryl.
Hi, Rachel. I actually work for Hadassah, and I'm curious about something. We actually worked really hard about 1.5 years ago to get Congress to pass the Never Again Education Act. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not, but we worked with some federations and we worked with the ADL to do that, and we got it passed. So now the bill is supposed to help us to get communities to raise money to be able to make sure that Holocaust education is in the school systems. So I know that the numbers, I forgot which way it goes. There's either like 11 states that have it or 11 states that don't have it. I forget which way it is. But I'm just curious from your standpoint, you know, obviously the objective is to get kids to have Holocaust education in their classroom so that they go home, maybe they educate their parents, or they grow up to be in a better world than the kids are right now. So I'm just curious about how much you believe that is doable, because to me it's I'm not going to say it's pie in the sky, but because you have to start somewhere. But there's so many places that they're not doing it. Small communities that don't have the money, or whatever the case, that maybe there's no Jews in the area, they don't care, whatever it is. And we're working with the Holocaust Museum in DC to put the curriculum together right now. So I'm just curious of your opinion on it. And I know that Peter Nelson's on here, and he's had a lot of experience in his career doing similar from the teacher side. So I'm just curious, from your standpoint, how much do you believe in education for the children will really help the situation?
So it's not fair to ask someone who loves education, how much do you believe in education? Because the answer is going to be a lot. At the same time, I will say that we do have a challenge with Holocaust education, and I'm very careful of how I say this, knowing that the Deaners are on here and that Peter's on here, because they are part of organizations that have had a lot to do with serious Holocaust education. But we know, for example, from some of the recent surveys, whether it's the Claims Conference, whether it's this new research that's coming from University of, I think, Arizona, but I'll double check, in which it's highlighting that people who do have access to Holocaust education still don't really know that much about the Holocaust. The Claims Conference research, whether you agree with it or not, suggests that millennial and Gen Z can't name, a concentration camp. They don't know how many Jews were murdered in a concentration during the Holocaust. And these are places that do have Holocaust education for the most part. So there is a question about, and Jeff Jacoby, who, is an opinion writer for the Boston Globe, just wrote today a piece about, because there's a bill, coming up here about genocide education, in which Holocaust education will be a part of it, and wrote, is Holocaust education actually the answer to combating anti-Semitism? And I would argue that you, of course, need Holocaust education. It'd be absurd to suggest that you don't need Holocaust education. But do I think that it combats anti-Semitism? I do not think so. And I'll just give you two anecdotal experiences. I've spoken with a lot of teachers in the New York area for quite a bit of time, asking them what they need in their communities and in their schools. And many of them have had the opportunities to study with Facing History, to go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for Professional Development. And they said, we actually know how to talk about the Holocaust. We can tell you details of what happens in Poland in 1942. We can tell you what happens in detail in 1939. It's not the history that we don't know. What we don't feel comfortable talking about is what's happening today in the streets of Brooklyn, or what was happening a year ago in Muncie. That we don't know how to talk about. We don't know how to talk about anti-Semitism coming from parts of the African-American community, or coming from influences within the Nation of Islam. That's a real challenge. And Holocaust education is not going to address that. And I'm not sure who is addressing that. And knowing that there are a lot of organizations out there who are trying to be in the educational space and do good work. The last thing I will say about education in this regard is that some of the organizations do want to talk about Holocaust education, but use it also to universalize. And when they universalize, at times it can diminish the particularism of the Jewish experience, the Jewish history, the Jewish traumas. And it's not to say that you shouldn't know about the other genocides, that looking at a younger, kind of age group, developmentally appropriately talking about bullying and upstander, those are important things. But when it's not rooted in the particularism, it also does diminish to a certain degree an understanding of anti-Semitism. The last thing I'll just say about education on this front too is, so, Yom HaShoah, as Rabbi Martin said, this is a hard time, except it's actually our busy season, right? Because everyone all of a sudden wants to talk about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. But I'll tell you, how many presentations was I given only 1 hour or 45 minutes this week? When I can tell you that on all other issues of diversity, they're getting a semester. And that's where I go back to that Jews very often are not considered to be a vulnerable minority. The Holocaust is considered to be the penultimate experience, and the Holocaust is now deemed to be quote unquote ancient history. And so therefore it doesn't get the same weight as other forms of hatred, whether it's racism, whether it's a form of homophobia, transphobia. And I'm not pitting these things against one another. They're all necessary to talk about, but it doesn't always happen in the way that we need it to happen in order to understand how anti-Semitism presents itself today.
That's great. I'm going to just clarify one thing. The bill actually that got passed was supposed to use the Holocaust as an education mechanism to help on all kinds of anti-Semitism and anti-hate. So it's also anti-hate across the board. So that helps a little bit, but I hear you're saying it's a lot of great points.
Alan.
Let's see. That's me, right? Hi, Rachel. I'm interested in what you said about the anti-Semitism on the right and on the left. And when I read Barry Weiss's articles or her book, she talks about anti-Semitism basically as a conspiracy theory. And that would seem to me that would apply to the anti-Semitism on the right more than the left. The left has more of a, I guess what you might call a rational basis to it. So there are some strange conspiracy theories out there. You haven't mentioned QAnon or the Jewish lasers that are controlled from space by the Rothschilds. Why do people latch on to the crazy conspiracy theories when it applies to Jews?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alan. For sure, QAnon, was absolutely a resurrection of the blood libel. And the space lasers, again, that's not the hard right, that is the right, just like we have those on the left who also do it. So for different reasons, different purposes, but they use Jews as an opportunity to other regularly. I will say when Barry talks about anti-Semitism as a conspiracy theory, I mean, part of what she's talking about is the way in which anti-Semitism does mutate, and that the idea that you are both punching up towards Jews because you see them as a threat and punching down towards Jews. And that is a unique aspect of anti-Semitism. Racism was never worrying about punching up towards Blacks. It was always punching down. But anti-Semitism is bidirectional. And so that poses a real challenge. And all I will say is that conspiracy theories are irrational. Anti-Semitism is irrational. And if it is irrational, this is why I will say Holocaust education doesn't solve the problem of dealing with anti-Semitism. So I can't give you a great answer because I don't think there's a great answer, but I think we are dealing with a millennia-old hatred that lacks rationality, however it is presented. Listen, you have Steve Bannon from the right talking about Zionism, but how does he talk about Zionism? in a very problematic way. Steve Bannon says, look at Zionism. Look what the Israelis figured out. The Israelis figured out how to systematize privileging Jews over other citizens that are non-Jewish. That's a form of white supremacy. We need to be doing that. So I'm a Zionist. I don't want Steve Bannon to be a Zionist. That's crazy, right? But that's how it's used. And then you have the hard left saying, anti-Zionist, I'm anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Semitic. So that's the guise. It's a political guise masquerading purely as anti-Semitism. Now, trust me, if it was anti-Zionism and they wanted to say, look, let's talk about the anti-Zionism within the ultra-Orthodox community, that would be a conversation that we would have. That is not the nuance and complexity they are talking about. They are not talking about, let's talk about the anti-Zionism who are coming from citizens who are Arab within Israel, but see themselves as citizens. Again, a conversation that can be had. They are saying Jews and the collective movement for Jewish self-determination has no right to exist, but all other self-determination movements exist. This is irrational, no matter how you slice it.
Mindy.
I just wonder how much you feel hatred within the Jewish community and plays into our difficulty fighting anti-Semitism. You know, in some ways, I feel that the hatred between the ultra-Orthodox and the non-Orthodox is as potent and angry as hatred by non-Jews toward Jews. And I'm just wondering if you feel that plays any role in our difficulty fighting anti-Semitism or addressing it.
I completely hear you, Mindy, and we know that these are real issues. There's no doubt about that. I really don't think most anti-Semites are paying that close attention to it at the end of the day about our own internal squabbles. It definitely doesn't help, that's for sure, but we're a very heterogeneous community. So
But how does it help it? How does it affect our image of ourselves? If we're disparaging a third of our population or a growing element of our population, how does it help us deal with anti-Semitism from outside?
Well, I don't think it helps us deal with anti-Semitism from outside. It's like, you know, when people talk about airing their dirty laundry in public, right? That doesn't help anyone at all. There are serious conversations that need to happen internally within the Jewish community at multiple levels. There's more understanding, and we need to be building the muscle of compassion for a variety of segments within the, you know, Jewish writ large collective, whether that's in Israel, whether it's in diaspora, whatever it may be. But I don't think that is the primary motivator for anti-Semitism. I'm not suggesting you said that, and I think anti-Semitism is going to exist in a serious and virulent way, irrespective of the conversations and the bickering and the serious challenges internally within the Jewish community. I will also say, we're not unique in this way. So let's not give ourselves too much credit, right? If you look at the discourse within the African-American community, there's real challenges that exist about understanding around issues related to racism. And it not only today, there's a history of it, whether it was, do you subscribe to Malcolm X or do you subscribe to Martin Luther King Jr.? They were not on the same page, and those were deep rifts between the community. I heard you had Mark Dollinger recently. I mean, he speaks quite a bit about this. And people are still not in the same place within the African-American community on many of these issues. So we aren't unique, but that's not, and similar to racism, those squabbles and those disagreements and those confrontations are not what is animating racism.
Claire or Arnie, Claire and Arnie.
Claire, right. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Claire.
So we are sending off 3 grandchildren to college this year, and I'm concerned about what I'm hearing on the campuses. I wonder, and I guess it's more anti-Israel, or is it more anti-Israel than anti-Semitism? And is anything effective being done to quell some of those animosities?
So I do think it's important to say that not every campus is burning. Some campuses are really incredible places still. It's the, you know, real engagement with intellectual ideas. And hopefully those are the places your grandchildren will be going. But I also think just the reality is that most likely there is a chance they will experience some type of, and I'm really clear, it's anti-Semitism. It's rarely at all just the discourse of, oh, I don't agree with Israel, or I don't like an Israeli policy. And that is a conversation for a separate time about how do we as the Jewish community teach children, teach students about Israel so that they can engage with the complexity of Israel. But that's not what's happening here. I'll tell you, last night or Tuesday night, I taught a group of students from Washington University in St. Louis. And they were giving me example after example of professors who use the classroom as a bully pulpit. So one student says to me, listen, I was in a stats class, statistics, nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the slide that goes up so that we can learn how to do statistics is, let's look at the worst human rights violators, and Israel's up here and all the other countries are down here. Now, if you're in a stats class, the majority of these students know nothing about the context of that conversation. So it's completely taken out of context, and the professor is promoting, in this case, his political agenda. And a student says, so what do I do? Right? What do I do in that situation? And you say, did you talk to the teacher? Did you go to the professor and explain why you thought it was a problematic example? No, I didn't. I felt uncomfortable doing that. Did you go to the department head? Well, the professor was the department head, so I didn't go to the department head. Did you go to the ombudsman? What's an ombudsman? Did you go to the Department of Student Affairs? No. So that's part of the challenge. Now, because Peter's on here, I know that there's an important organization I have to say, even if he wasn't on here, which is the Academic Engagement Network. This is an organization that exists really for the purpose of helping faculty and also now university administrators, but also providing support to students via faculty support in order to help faculty be prepared and also navigate the challenges that they as faculty experience when they try to stand up to some of these issues with their colleagues, because they're under immense pressure. They won't get published in academic journals. They won't be invited to speak at specific conferences. They won't get published by academic presses, right? I can tell you who you don't send a manuscript to because it will never see the light of day if it has to do with Israel. I know. All of us know who are in the business. So that's a real challenge. And that's not going away anytime soon. I will say that there is some effort both from the Academic Engagement Network, from Hillel International through the Center for Campus Climate with Mark Rotenberg, who's excellent, which are really trying to help university administrators by training those university administrators so that they are more sensitive and aware of the mutations of anti-Semitism and help sensitize those administrators. So when a student comes to them, those administrators don't say, oh no, that's just a political discomfort you have, but actually say, okay, something is crossing a line here and we need to support or figure out how to support students. I'll give you another example. A student at Vanderbilt University 2 weeks ago was running for student government. This is a little bit complicated, but it's important to say. The student is a Jewish student from Miami, middle class. He's been involved in making sure that there are, that there are opportunities for all different types of students. He's really been involved in work study opportunities for all different types of students from different backgrounds so that they can afford university, so on and so forth. He decides to run for student government. Turns out that when he was a freshman, he went to a fraternity party that had a themed party at Vanderbilt on the North-South, right? The North and the South. That was the theme of the party. When he was running against two African-American women. When they asked him if he was at this party, he panicked and he said no. Turns out he was. So then he was embarrassed. He also had joined the fraternity. The fraternity had gotten rid of the North-South parties. The fraternity has African Americans in their fraternity, but he was automatically labeled a white supremacist. Okay, this is a Jewish kid. This is not a kid who's a white supremacist. Then what happens? There's an entire campaign defaming him, calling him terrible names that are anti-Semitic, suggesting that Hitler didn't finish the job. And this kid decides no longer to run for student government. He makes the most pathetic video I have ever seen. I mean, truly, like it looked like a hostage video in which he's confessing how terrible of a person he is, that he went to this party. And all of the students on the other side are saying, you're a colonialist. Colonialist means you're a Zionist. Zionist means you're a white supremacist. It's a very simple equation. And this kid is demoralized. He's demoralized. Now, the university has not yet done anything because to them, this is all freedom of speech. But it crosses a line. And if, you know, anyone defamed the two African-American students with the kind of language that he was defamed with, the university administration, I am confident, would have done something. And they didn't. So these are some of the challenges. Hillel Center for Campus Climate is involved in this. And there are a lot more organizations that are around to support students. But I will just say, even though I know campuses aren't burning, the discourse on many campuses is still a discourse that puts Jews in a defensive reactionary position. And so many Jews don't want to be, and Jewish students don't want to be involved in that because it's very painful and it's very hard. So it's a challenge.
That's cool.
I wanted to ask Peter. Peter had sent me a little message in the chat, something to add to the Holocaust education question.
Thanks, Rabbi Martyr. Hi, Rachel. And thanks for mentioning Academic Engagement Network. I'm not engaged with them, but I love their fight against BDS. And as I think importantly, the fighting for academic freedom. And I think that's, I guess, what I wanted to talk about a little bit. I will get to the education in a second, but I wanted to first double down on what you said rightly, that much of this is not about a logic. It's more about, in many ways, conclusions that look for evidence instead of evidence that leads to conclusions. And similarly, a lot of it is emotive. It's the old Jonathan Swift claim that you can't reason someone out of something they haven't reasoned themselves into. So we keep trying to apply articles of reason and syllogistic reasoning with people who are emotionally drawn to these answers to deal with their own lives. And that's kind of at the individual level, but I wanted to get back, as Rabbi Martyr mentioned, to the question of education. And I think Holocaust education is a little bit of not a misnomer, but I think it's a coverall that doesn't really apply to all things equally. Certainly I have an affection for Facing History, which I used to work at, and in which I think it was much more concerned with the pre than the actual time of the Holocaust. It's not clear to me what one gains if one knows where the camps were, what the difference between a death and a labor camp, how many Jews died in each place. If I'm in the Holocaust, I know what will happen to me. I'll die. It's really not educative. It's educative in that I never want to be anywhere near it. And that's why it's so important. But I think, and this is a little of what I wrote to Rabbi Martyr, that I listened to Yitz Greenberg earlier today. He spoke for Hadar, and he was really extolling the importance. First of all, the lesson learned was of people like the Jews or any people who are a minority cannot depend on the morality of the world to come to their rescue, ergo Israel, ergo have power to protect yourself. But if there is something one can try to count on, it's democracy was his biggest push. that democracy has to be a place in which centralized government is not allowed to exceed the power it should have if its government is really balanced. That was one of the heinous elements of the Hitlerian approach, was to knock out all opposition, to end democracy, and therefore the protection that government might be able to advocate was eliminated. And here in this country, the question is, how much can we keep this a robust democracy in which it actually does what its aspirational claims are, which is to be there for all, not just for some. Obviously, it's won and lost on that ground a lot, but if there's one thing we can do, it's policy. If there's one thing we can do, it's to reinforce the institutions, which in some ways is what people like Ibram Kendi is talking about when he talks about anti-racism. He says, enough with suasion, enough with trying to influence or get people to change their attitudes. Make the policy change first, and the attitudes will follow. What do you think of that?
Look, I think in abstract, it makes a lot of sense. The question are, what are the policies? And that is the question. And, you know, right, until we actually see them concretized, or at least a blueprint, it's hard to know. I'd like to think that the policies will be the kinds of policies we would want to protect different types of communities. But until we see them, I wouldn't want to advocate for policies in abstract.
Right. But wouldn't it then be incumbent upon us, not to say it's not already happening, that we start writing those policy suggestions, and in concert with perhaps other groups who similarly feel at risk, even in this democracy here in the United States, which is where we are. So how do we find a critical mass to make sure the policies are both protective of Jewish interests, but also of all, believing that if it is protective of all, it'll be protective of us?
Yeah, the JCPA was doing some of this, the Jewish Center for Public Affairs, and then trying to bring it to the local JCRCs, and then working closely with other community relations outside of the Jewish community, specifically, as you're saying. Part of the challenge has been is that there hasn't been that much agreement between the various groups at the end of the day in terms of the tangible policy. So that's why we don't know what it will look like. And hopefully some of those groups will be able to make some inroads, but we haven't yet seen that come to fruition. But it doesn't mean it's not possible, but I do think it will take time, because I agree with you that you may not be able to change individuals and influence those individuals at the end of the day singly, and you might need to start with this more top-down approach. But I will also say that people usually come, especially today, from a very particular identity politics, and those identity politics actually can be harmful. Even though people think that it's part of a multicultural society, it actually is in some ways creating more silos within that society, which doesn't actually really engage with pluralism in a serious and meaningful way.
If I could add just one little thing to that, and I can't disagree with you. And then the question is, and some people again within the African-American community say, you want to help us and move things to an anti-racist position, then get in relationship with us. And that's how you develop some of that, right? So I think we just have to start getting into honest and sincere relationships with people who are not Jewish necessarily, at least Jews of color within the Jewish family, and then obviously beyond the Jewish family with folks who I think share some of our interests. And if it's relational, then there's trust. If there's trust, then there's a possibility of transcending these walls that we've built in these little silos of identity. They're malleable, I think, if we can just find a way to do it sincerely as opposed to transactionally.
I fully agree, which is why I use that example of Operation Understanding DC, because that's an example of that kind of relationship. And I would also just add that navigating the Israel part of that conversation is inevitable. And so we cannot think that we will be immune to that.
And there we need the muscle of compassion and the courage to listen and to speak up. But to do all of those things. Thank you so much, Dr. Fish, and thank you everyone for your questions. This was fascinating, and it was really interesting to do a deep dive into the history a bit and to think about the present day and what we can do going forward. So really, we appreciate it. And thanks everyone for being here this conversation.
I just wanted to remind everybody that on April 18th at 4 o'clock is the South Orange Maplewood Interfaith Holocaust ceremony, whatever, and it's online. It's a Zoom.
It's actually, I think it's on YouTube. I think they pre-recorded it. It's on YouTube, I think.
Is it? Okay, I don't know.
Do we have a link to it? Are we going to get a link to it?
Oh, yeah.
I think
I've already got it, links to it. I was looking for it.
I think if you go to rememberandtell.com, I think it is, or .org, I forget which, you'll see.
And Ada Beth will do you one better.
The weekly email that went out. It's there. The flyer's there. And
okay.
Yes, thank you, Carol. And the flyer everybody has in their inbox now. And for a few weeks, we've had the flyer to the service. So thank you for reminding us of that. Very important to
Rabbi
attend.
Martyr, I just want to say one thing before you end, because I have a poem that some people may know, but because it's Yom HaShoah, I feel we should end with a poem from a woman that whose name you may know, Sonia White, who was born in Krakow, Poland. I'm sure Peter knows this piece. And she was 11 years old when her family and other Polish Jews were herded into the ghettos by the Nazis. And I believe, and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, something like 84 members of her family at the end of her extended family, including her sister, and others, were put into these ghettos. And she and her sister, Sonia and her sister, were the only survivors of that family at the end of the day. And she began writing poetry at a very early age, and she turned to poetry to help her cope with the trauma that she experienced. So she wrote this one poem, and if it's okay, I'd like to just share this one poem. She wrote many poems, but this one poem called For Yom HaShoah. And the poem is the following. Come take this giant leap with me into the other world, the other place where language fails and imagery denies man's consciousness, and dies upon the altar of insanity. Come take this giant leap with me into the other world, the other place, and trace the eclipse of humanity, where children burned while mankind stood by, and the universe has yet to learn why. And I think it's precisely this yet to learn why that is animating so much of what we continue to see today. Yeah. And that demands of us the responsibility when we see it, whether it's towards our own community or any community, that we actually do and stand up in order to combat it.
Thank you. That is a wonderful way to end. When we talk about Yom HaShoah, it's beyond words. And so to end with poetry and to end with that emotion was, thank you, a really beautiful touch. So may we go forward, may we fight anti-Semitism, may we continue building bridges to other communities and open our hearts and our ears. And as we say, l'chaim, always moving forward to life, to keep living, to keep thriving, which is what we also do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See the deaner sitting in the back.
Yeah.